That's basically what I live for.
Welcome to Matt Bailey's Whisky Love Song Dedications.
Hey, you know what? It's a good intro.
You now, Matt Bailey.
You're tuned to Matt Bailey FM. Okay, just get this out there. There's the link if you want to spread it out. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We're live again. It's Whisky Roundtable. Sends us Scott Fitzsimons. I'll have to cover in for both of Scott and myself tonight, which means I'll be 1/3 of each. So we've got our regular guests, Andy Milne and Alex Dallenberg, and we've got two special guests with us tonight, two superstars from Whisky and Ailment, Emma Cookson and Lockie Watt. Good to see you guys.
Hey, guys.
G'day.
We're all in here. Okay. Does everyone want to say hello in cases, because we are broadcasting to often a little bit of a different audience from Scott Fitzsimons' Oak Barrel audience. So, of course, if you want to introduce yourselves, Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Andy. I'm the whiskey brand manager for South Trade. So I look after Dublin Liberties in Ireland. I look after Annock, Old Pulteney, and Staburn in Scotland, and Balblair, Paul John in India, Kuryoshi from Japan, and then I also look after Buffalo Trace for America, along with some other bits and bobs.
Awesome. Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex Dallenberg, and I like whiskey.
Yeah, okay. Let's leave it there, right? Yeah, sure.
I also I work for the Speakeasy Group, which has probably one of the biggest whiskey portfolios across our 7, nearly 8 venues. And I do a lot of the whiskey stuff for them. So I currently run Miona, and I have just opened Kiss Kiss Bang Bang.
Yes, it just opened, yeah.
So, yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Lockie, hit me up.
All right, I'm Lachlan. I'm the venue manager of Whisky and Ailment, and I just drink too much whiskey.
Emma, go for it.
I'm Emma. I also work at Whisky and Ailment. I'm just your boots on the ground bartender. I'll be the
most important part.
The most important part.
Yeah, the people person.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, great. I mean, the discussion tonight was, which we were picking up from where sort of we left off from Scotty last week in some ways. We sort of started touching a bit on this last week, and we realized that we didn't want to get 3.5 hours in and never end. And I think I was getting a bit tired, and I think a few maybe others were as well. I can't speak for anyone else, but the idea was tonight we're talking a bit about labeling, about regionality, and recommendations. Lockie and Emma, we touched on this very briefly an hour ago, but it's that third part is sort of about how recommendations work from a bar standpoint. I think particularly you two plus Alex would have quite a unique view on that. One that I honestly know nothing about. It's that I'm always keen to learn more about, and I think, but we might start with labeling and how labels, how people approach labels in whiskey, how people approach different, like how selection works from a label standpoint, and how that influences decisions. Andy, this is something you sort of kicked off with earlier, and if you want to start us off on that.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose it's the age-old debate. There's specifically within Scotland, I think there's this obsession of Speyside or Highland or Islay, and I sort of hear quite often in events and tastings, and people saying, "Oh, I really like Speyside whiskey," or "I really like Highland whiskey," and I sort of get a bit lost, and I'm sitting there thinking, well, what do you like? What is that? Because to me, there's so much variety in those regions. I think Islay's the only one that probably has an element of, yes, this is quite typically Islay whiskey, and there's a couple of exceptions in there, obviously, but on the whole, regions don't, to me, make that sort of. It isn't a point where you can say, "Yep, clearly a Campbelltown whiskey. And just before we came live, we were talking about Campbelltown is, one distillery alone in Campbelltown makes 3 different styles of whiskey, and they famously lost their status as Campbelltown. And then the guys at Springbank went, all right, we'll sod it, we'll just open a new distillery down the road, and open Glengyle, and then went back and said, now we have the same amount of distilleries as the Lowlands, so make us a region again.
It's 2 to be a region, correct?
3.
3.
So you got Glengyle, Springbank, and
Glen Scotia.
Glen Scotia. But it's, in one distillery you make 3 different styles of whiskies. So how can we why are you fighting for Campbelltown as a region? What does that mean, and what's the benefit of being Campbelltown, being Speyside, being Highland? And I suppose, from a bar perspective, how do you navigate that with customers? Because, I presume that you don't take it on and say, cool, this is another Speyside malt that I'm sure you'll love, because
it's such a broad topic. So
yeah.
I have I've had peated Speyside.
Well,
yeah.
I think, also when we talk regions, like 5 regions in Scotland, our owner Sven says there's only 3 regions: Highlands, Lowlands, and Islands. So depending on how you roll with it, when I'm over the bar, I think you can't recommend or say what kind of region do you like your whiskey from, as much as you can say what kind of brand do you drink at home, and then take them from there.
I think the closest thing we can say for regionality is there is over 36 regions in the world currently, which includes Scotland, Ireland, America, Australia. They're also all encompassing, and the stylistic differences between individual distilleries should be not talked in regionality between, this is a Highland whiskey or a Speyside whiskey. This should be talked as, this is a Scottish whiskey that tastes like this. It's from this distillery, or it's a blend of these 2 products, which will create these flavors. One of the things that we have always pushed for at Whisky and Ailment is the talk of purely flavor profiles, not talking about regions, not talking about anything. For example, with that Campbelltown thing, in one of my whiskey tastings, we talk about Springbank being the perfect example of a distillery going against regionality, producing 3 different styles of whiskey at the one distillery. Whereas all these people pushing for having a Speyside whiskey or a Highland whiskey, we need to communicate that from a bar perspective as to just flavor profiles. I like a whiskey that's spicy and rich, or dry and fruity, or, same way a lot of people approach wine. So
I think regionality in whiskey these days, especially in Scotch whiskey, is mostly bunk. Even Alex's comment before, it's like, I've had peated Speysiders, of course. Peated Highland whiskies. I've had unpeated Islay whiskies.
Exactly.
It's like, you go, well, what's the purpose of regionality? Is it just flavor, or does it take in, like, obviously unpeated, like does it include terroir? Does it include all those other factors? Or because it is, if you take into that sort of consideration, it's like, let's be honest, an unpeated Islay whiskey tastes a lot different from an unpeated Speyside whiskey, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Unpeated Brookladdy is a good example. Unpeated Bunnahabhain is a good example. It's like they don't taste like, they've still got an element of the spirit of where they're made, rather than being
Absolutely.
I feel like Lockie touched on a great point. Gone are the days where bars are separating whiskies by regions on their lists.
Yeah.
So, for example, all Speakeasy Group have a flavour profile wheel, and we split them up into that. It's depending on each brand of the venue. So we've got like salty sea dogs at Meolna, and it ties into the brand, and we split up via flavour profile now.
Yeah.
You just need to have probably a couple of good people really executing that flavour profile within the company. But I mean, even on our whiskey app, the Meolna whiskey app, on the flavour profile wheel, they're all split up.
Yeah.
Emma, do you ever recommend on regionality, or?
I'm going to be a little bit controversial. I think it is good.
Here we go.
Here it comes. I think it is to a point useful. I think for me, being behind a bar, you know, you get those people who are like, oh, I only drink Islay whiskeys, I only drink Islay whiskeys. And for me, that immediately tells me not necessarily that, oh, you know, they, you know, will drink anything from Islay. It's more of they have this idea in their head that, you know, for many, many decades, we've essentially assigned each of these regions a flavor profile. And so by them coming up and saying that, I'm like, okay, I know what flavor profile you want without having to ask you, you know, because I could give you a Bunnahabhain 12-year-old and you throw it in my face and you're like, this isn't anything like I drink from Islay, you know, but I can then be like, okay, cool, I'm going to get you a Balakin. You're not even going to know it's from the Highlands, you know. And for me, I find that's helpful, but I think it's more of a kind of a temporary, this is kind of the way that it's been set up, and so use it to your advantage. And then, you know, slowly over time, we can push people away from the idea of, well, you know, a Speyside has to be this and a Highland has to be that and all that kind of stuff, and move people more towards, okay, what flavors do you like? So that, you know, they can broaden their understanding of, you know, flavors and the lack of regionality. Really.
But I think to comment on that is a lot of companies need to move away from that that conversation of regionality and actually start talking about flavor rather than just being able to cheapen out, just say this is a classic Speyside whiskey and yet it's peated Benromach, you know. People taste it and it's just like, what the fuck am I drinking right now? The communication doesn't stop with bartenders, it stops with producers confusing people with marketing on the bottles. So
well, that's something I want to delve a bit deeper into tonight as well. I mean, I'll just grab a comment from Hayden on the line here, who says, "Hi Hayden. Personally, I find whiskey is a mood too. Sometimes I feel like a heavily peated Islay Monster, and sometimes I feel like a delicate and floral Speysider. Sometimes I just want to walk into a bar and let an amazing bartender choose my journey for me."
You and me both.
Mm.
Yeah, isn't that the dream?
But
Exactly.
if you flip it onto the other side, you look at what wine has done, and so coming from the UK, and I used to sell wine years ago, and the old school consumer was coming in and said, you know, I like Bordeaux, or I like Burgundy, or I like Rioja, and it was very much they had this region in the world that they sort of thought, yeah, that's what I like, and that's what I've worked out I like. And then the New World came in, and Australian wine, you know, drove them through into Europe and Chilean and Argentinian, and people suddenly started realizing that, you know, there's these grapes, and they're like, oh shit, actually I like Cab Sav. I was like, Cab Sav is really nice. That's a delicious wine. I like Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is what I like. And people learned that, and it is a flavor, and it's a flavor profile and a style.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the way that you know, I remember tracking consumer sort of acknowledgement of labels, and it was, you know, it went from region to grape, and they had no loyalty to a region or a country, and then they had complete loyalty to a grape variety, and that was how they purchased their wine. But for whiskey, what, you know, legally for most regions, we're not allowed to put a style, and single malt is different across the world and across each region. So, you know, what if you were I love the idea that, you know, you go to a bar, and a great bar and a great independent retailer as well, you get this great recommendation of, I want a whiskey like this, or I like this whiskey, what can you recommend? And you get a great recommendation of, you know, a decent whiskey that fits that similar profile. But in your head, you're going, okay, yeah, so it's Benromach, so it's quite rich, it's quite sherry, it's quite full-bodied. Yeah, okay, so you'll also like Mortlach, Dahlewin, you know, so forth, and your head sort of goes, yeah, these are you're working out the flavor profiles. But from a consumer's point of view, they don't get those, and you get aggressors.
Right.
You know, how
do you think you should learn more from the wine trade, or shouldn't? Is that what is?
I don't know, because the thing is that the wine trade just put the grape varieties on. You know, it was a simple thing, but it It wasn't, it's not an easy thing that the whiskey industry, I think cask type, probably is something that will make, a consumer journey far easier. Where we talk about flavor profiles and styles, most of that's driven by cask type. So I think a lot of people would, driven by sherry, by port, by, bourbon, and that helps steer them into a mindset because, the more they talk about that, the more they understand this is that style of flavor. And I think you get far more out of bourbon cask than you would Speyside and Highland.
Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I think transparency is ideally the key. Like I would like to see producers being putting onto their bottles completely transparent comments on how this whiskey was produced. It doesn't have to have vintages. It doesn't have to have ages. It just needs to be transparent. We've used, barley that's been peated or unpeated. It's been matured in this series of casks to allow people to just break through that marketing barrier of, this is Macallan Ruby. It's the color of a ruby, part of the stripper series.
I'll have a Sienna. Oh, you're a fan of the strippers.
Yeah, exactly. It's
I'm glad
nonsense.
that's carried. I'm so glad that that's continued on.
So
they'll never live that one down.
No, they won't.
Ruby and amber. Come on. I mean, you
Sienna.
Do you know
what's even better? Very off tangent for a short second. What's even better about that Sienna is that my phone number is apparently 1 digit different from an escort service in Victoria.
Of course.
And that escort's name is Sienna. and I regularly get text messages because she even puts her number out with my number, not hers. I the sheer volume of text, I've gone and researched this and worked out who this person is, but she keeps on getting my number wrong as well.
So did you just message them back saying, no, this is Macallan?
Would you like to buy a Macallan?
I did tell someone to stay at home, and so I got a text about a week ago saying, are you doing in visits? So I was just like, no, it's isolation, stay at home, don't leave the house. And you're like, yeah, fair play, good point.
You're doing good, honest work.
Yeah, exactly. I'm helping the world.
Yeah.
Big shout out to everyone who's tuned in, by the way. A lot of people watching, which is great. Adam, Tom, Kate, Gerald, Ben, Daniel, Simon, Jonathan, David, Alicia, Kevin, and everyone on the society page as well. Thank you so much. This has been great. A question from Hayden again, who asks, as a novice consumer, it can be so easy to fall for marketing hype and age statements. Tips from the Whisky Roundtable about how to get around the marketing hype. So that's a pretty broad question, and one that I'd love to delve into a bit more marketing, of course, as we're going to get to that. Unless anyone wants to still stick on regionality, I'm easy either way.
Do it.
Oh, I love to destroy marketing hype.
All right.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm in for a rough night now already.
I've not got enough booze here though. So.
Zeno, however, says, Andy, you can push Starwood on OnlyFans. There you go.
Wow.
Logging in now. We're done.
Do you want my account?
I think our viewers might not be the same. It's slightly different, not the quite crossover that we need.
I'm pretty sure Solera is a good stripper name anyway. So.
Pretty unique, that one.
Oh, dear.
I think the way around marketing hype is just to try. And that's where your bars come in, because I mean, a lot of consumers are looking at buying from bottle shops or retail. And if you're seeing a whiskey with that marketing hype, a lot of bars will have it. I know that I, for one, gun to head, go blazing to get any new whiskey that's coming out that's got a fair bit of hype around it. Sorry to all the brand ambassadors out there in the world. But we have it on our back bars fairly soon. And to get around the marketing hype, go into your venues, go into your big whiskey bars. They'll have it, they'll stock it. And you can try it then and actually see if it's worth the hype before you buy a bottle.
Yeah. I think
I don't think it's even around that. I think it's more about just like, for example, your classic whiskey. So for example, your base range classic malts or classic brands of whiskey, they've got all this marketing nonsense and jargon on it that, for example, the person who's never really examined the whiskey industry before won't understand this. And so they go in trying to buy a nice whiskey and they end up coming away with something that they don't really want or need because it's just completely confusing jargon. Why not just break it down to being completely transparent and being honest? Which I think is the one thing that came out of the post-1960s through the 1990s that really ruined the Scotch whisky industry.
Speaking of marketing, there's one I've referenced before. I think I even referenced in like the week 1 of Roundtable. One of my favorite ever examples of like whiskey marketing on overdrive on steroids would have to be, there was a bottle of Fetacan and it was a core range bottling. It was a 10-year-old at 40% ABV. It had coloring added. It was chill filtered and it came in this black tube and it said on the tube, on the outside of the tube, the world's best whiskey. On the tube. It takes some balls of steel to write that on a 10-year-old age statement, 40% whiskey.
I'm trying to find my favorite piece of whiskey bottle marketing ever, but it was a Japanese whiskey called Saturday, and the label is absolutely sensational.
The whiskey was called Saturday.
Yeah.
As in like a whiskey that is best consumed on a Saturday.
I'm sorry.
It was endorsed by Elton John, surely.
It was called it was Kirin Saturday #1, and it was called High Performance Whiskey.
Ooh.
Is it a Gatorade ad or a whiskey ad?
Straight after sport, I love high performance whiskey.
I have just found it. It is absolutely incredible. It was from the 80s. It was from the 1980s. So it was in the like kind of Japanese period where they were marketing their whiskey to be high performance for the younger crowd, basically. And so they created all these really fucking weird brands of whiskey. But one is Saturday, and it's called Saturday is the it says Saturday is the high quality whiskey for the new aged suitable for sophisticated men wishing to relax and express their desired way of life, light and smooth.
Well, there's nothing sophisticated about women. Sorry.
It is absolute nonsense. It's fucking incredible.
Okay, Emma, you're about to say sorry.
I think the biggest thing around marketing is like, you know, we're constantly bombarded with marketing about everything. You know, I really love remembering all those like old ads. I still remember that bloody Bundaberg ad on the pirate ship. But I think the biggest part,
the Han Dryad with the tongue.
Yeah, with the tongue. No. But I think, you know, with kind of going against the marketing is just talk to people. Talk to, you know, people you know who drink whiskey, who like whiskey, kind of see what their opinions on it are, on, you know, on the brand, on the whiskey, all that kind of stuff. Go to places like, you know, Mjolnir and Whiskey and Almond and places like that, where, you know, you're going to get someone who spends a lot of time, you know, looking at this stuff and sifting through all that marketing stuff.
I mean, it can be useful. The marketing can be useful. It's just it can also be to the detriment. As in, like, if it wasn't any marketing, it's sort of like there'd be so many whiskeys that you'd never even hear of. I mean,
I think,
and there are. I mean, that's also part of the problem. There's like, there are great whiskeys you never hear of, and they just are a lost entry somewhere in Whiskey Base because it's like, oh, well, you know, there's no importer for it, there's no interest in it, there's no market for it because it wasn't marketed properly.
And that's half the challenge. It's how much, it's how loud can you shout, and there's an element of marketing spiel and, you know, truth or, you know, softened truth. But there is also an element of, you know, actually how loud can you shout? And, you know, the brands that I work with in Australia are generally sort of we're quite small independent distilleries, and so we don't have a huge budget to sit there and go, I can't sit there and go, all right, let's do a big, campaign on bus stops. Let's do a big campaign across, digital and spend $20,000 on this huge campaign where people will realize and see us and understand us. It's, so.
Well, none of us work for the big four, so that's out of the question. The bus stops and the billboards.
Yeah, but I think what's great is it makes us
out there.
It makes us
love it.
I mean, like if you say it,
that's a cognac talk. That is.
It is. It is. It's wine talk.
On we've got two different types of bars around this virtual table. My venue's quite high turnover, consumer. Very consumer base, whereas Whisky and Almond is like the connoisseurs, correct?
Not entirely. So while we have a large basis of regulars that are, I guess, connoisseurs, and that have been a part of our identity for, some of which have been a part of our identity for almost 10 years. I think a Whisky and Almond has had a long identity of being one of the premier whiskey bars at least in Melbourne. And the one thing about whiskey and Almond that I've always found personally alluring and very, very incredible is that it's just low key. It's low turnover. It's not low turnover. That's not what I mean. It's quiet. It's easily accessible. You walk in there, you are immediately comfortable. It's a very, very small place. I've always really enjoyed that. It's so comfortable and comfy and enjoyable, which I think is why a lot of people come there to have their quiet dram a couple of times a week and then, go do other things,
So where I was getting to with that is the fact that you guys would be able to sell quite a lot of independent bottlings that don't have that huge consumer marketing hype around it. In my venue, unfortunately, in Miona, I buy some of these most amazing independent bottles or bottlings and put them on the list. I do list them via the distillery and put IB next to it, for example.
Yeah.
But a lot of them won't in this venue because it is so consumer and high turnover. We get the big names called. And that's where it comes down to our staff basically going, hey, so you love that. We've got one that's a little bit different. It's an independent bottling, and driving them to that. And that's where one of the marketing things is quite a bonus from our perspective, that we get to drive that whiskey. For example, I know it's always a great example is Octomores. Octomores in our venues, like any of the Octomore dinners, it's sold out like that. Because it is one of those things that's got the brand behind it, the marketing, and it has become is quite cult now. But they're the dinners that sell out the quickest for us, like Pete and me. And a lot of them are the bigger distilleries, which have that marketing fund behind them. And that's what we sell in our venues. Unfortunately, for my own ego, I've had to stop pulling back on the independent bottlings for Miona, because unless I've got a staff member or myself in there selling the hell out of it, we sell the marketed whiskies.
Yeah.
And that works for your venue, so it makes sense to do that.
If it works for your clientele, it works for your venue. That's perfect.
Yeah.
A couple of comments coming through here is I do wish the terms natural cask strength versus distiller's cask strength was used more widely. Can't disagree with you there. And the Whiskey is My Jam says, surely the pick up a teacher from the 1970s is the all-time favorite marketing winner.
I don't know. I think
so. Look, there was so much dodgy marketing in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, we could do a whole 2-hour presentation just on 70s adverts
or extremely inappropriate marketing of whiskey in that era.
I still think Cougar is the balls to the wall.
That was great. Terrible, but great.
There are still, unfortunately, some whiskey companies that still market like that, as we've seen more recently. But I'm not going to throw their names into the dog poo just yet.
I think we're all doing really well, though.
I think as well. So, because no marketing ever happens without marketing research behind it. So realistically, if you are getting pulled in by those marketing campaigns, you are their target audience. Ultimately, that's who it is. No one's out there, with the cougar thing. No one's getting excited about cougar when they're offended by the ad. There's a market. They've done research into it, and if you are intrigued,
we touched on last week that I was a cougar girl back in the day.
There's nothing wrong with it. I think everyone here can all say that they've
Sorry, I'm not mute when I marked in. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, I don't mean drank cougar, as in I was in the cougar top marketing cougar.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, that
clarity there. That's a strong clarity.
I'd be a cougar girl now.
Yeah.
But I think there's
We've got to leave that to OnlyFans, right?
Yeah, that's the only fan
exactly.
side of it. Yeah.
Whisky Roundtable.
Gerald De Los Santos says, and hi Gerald, good to see you, mate. Understanding how climate in each major countries affects whiskey is usually a good way to overcome age statements, in my opinion. Knowing that a lot of Australian or Taiwanese whiskey at 3 to 7 years of age can be similar to a lot of 8 to 15-year-old Scotch helps. I think regionality in terms of they are obviously very different in profile. Even quite a novice or intermediate whiskey taster could probably pick out a Tasmanian to a Taiwanese to a Scotch whiskey, maybe. I think we'll come back to that. And knowing that a lot of different awards out there are also judged and set up different helps take a big gold stickers on whiskey boxes with a pinch of salt. Yeah, whiskey awards is another topic on the marketing of the spirit, of course.
It's a large number in terms of the age statement side. Well, outside of Scotland, how many countries actually focus on age? And even America, which was probably the other big age-driven country, has kind of pushed away. So Elijah Craig 12, Lockie, I see you're ready to shout at me. But Elijah Craig 12 is no longer Elijah Craig 12, and a lot of what was it, Wild Turkey, stop putting their age statements on. And I was chatting to Sasha, that's now beneath Trouser Lane, last week. He was asking me, he said, I'm talking about Buffalo Trace. He's like, do you mind? I said, I presume it's about 4 years old. I was like, no, it's actually 8. I was like, it's between 8 and 12 years old. And he's like, what? He's like, why don't you say that? It's like, because we don't. And I think I always get confused with the laws and with legalization of Kentucky Straight Bourbon. But I don't think we can, from memory. I think it's under 4 you can and over 4 you can't, or it's the other way around.
You absolutely can. It's under 4 you can. Under 4 you have to. So if it's
over, you don't have
2
to.
and 4 you have to, but over 4 you can.
Yeah.
But you have to define it as the minimum age, just the
minimum age, yeah. But it's that thing. It's like we don't, because it's irrelevant. And it's that tough thing. It's that, well, for some reason, Scotland in the 80s, 90s kind of went, age is really important. We're going to tell you that that's super important. And the rest of the world has just carried on and gone, it's not. And it would be super confusing if the rest of the world carried on that, if Taiwan started putting age statements on and then, and India and Australia and America started putting age statements on. And they're like,
can you imagine having a 10-year-old Taiwanese whiskey?
Yeah.
There are actually a few 9-year-old casks sitting at Cavalan, and they probably taste like liquids, probably molasses at this point.
Yeah.
I remember a
violin.
But I remember a conversation with an Indian distiller, and he was saying, we're going to release India's oldest whiskey. And I think it was 12 years old. And the confusing thing is I also know another person who has casks of Indian whiskey maturing in Scotland. That is well over 12 years old. It's like, what the hell do you label that as when it comes to the time of labor?
Very true.
I mean, as Lockie said before, transparency is sort of there, isn't it? It's like, what he should label it is Indian spirit matured in Scotland for this long.
But you look at rum and you don't have to do that.
Oh,
So tropical aging.
So don't worry, it's fine.
well, you look at rum.
Come on, I'll have to get a rise out of someone. I like. Come on.
So we've recently had a rum across the bar it specified on the label that it was matured in Scotland for 25 years.
Really?
Yeah. No, it was bottled by an Italian bottler, Samaroli, Silvano S. Samaroli. But it specified it was matured in Scotland for 25 years. But also with Cadenheads, they bought a bunch of Tassie whiskies, shipped them over to Scotland, matured them in Campbelltown, and then sold them as Tasmanian whiskies without talking about their Scottish maturation.
Yeah, there's a cool.
That was super fucking strange.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there was a cool story behind those casks, which I'll go into another time. Keenan Sala says, OBs for the investor, IBs for the connoisseur. What is the panel take on that classic statement? I disagree with it wholeheartedly, but I'd love to hear everyone else's.
Disagree.
Yeah, I think.
Alex, you're edging out a frame here. What's going on?
I'm not commenting.
Okay. No comment.
No comment. And go.
As someone who, when I left the UK just over 2 years ago, I had a very large collection of whiskey that I hadn't presumed that I was going to be moving to Australia, so I amassed a large collection of whiskey and needed some cash to make sure that I was able to live for a reasonable amount of time without a job when I moved here. So I sort of took a view on some of my whiskeys that I had in the collection and thought, do I actually want to drink this? Do I not? Do I care about this? And so I put a lot of stuff on auction. Some really interesting things came out of that. So I actually made more money than retail on 2 Dalmores and 2 or 3 plantation rums that they could have just bought in a store for less, and someone bidded more for those bottles. And I think it sort of goes some way to say that their weight pushed them above the retail price and someone didn't really pay attention. But the independent bottlings, I only put a couple on because most of them I wanted to keep, but I had a double up of a couple of things, and they weren't big distillery names, but they were the worst performing of all. And they were really, really good signatory bottlings that just didn't get the popularity. And
that can often be the case, and we see that. I mean, at the same time, on the same token, it's like even society bottles that we've released 3 months ago, then I see at auction for 2 or 3 times what we released it for. Kind of makes me a little bit depressed, but at the same time, it's like they appreciate and value a lot of them. I mean, maybe not a lot of the younger Speyside casks might not, but certainly things like some of the 29s and 33s and stuff that we've released. Emma, do you collect much yourself, or are you?
Because I'm in the process of packing to move, so I've accidentally done a stock take on all my bottles, and I've thinking of the bottles that I have. I've started collecting more indie bottlings, but I think even without being a connoisseur, independent bottlings are a great thing to have in your collection. Just because the range of stuff that you can get for something an OB would break the bank for. But thinking of my collection, the ones that I know that I could resell for the most value are all original bottlings, actually. So
right.
Yeah.
I mean, and that is often the case because they seem to hold their value being core range bottlings. I still don't. I mean, I understand that because that is marketing. Let's go back to what we were saying before.
Can I just say hi, Mum?
Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, Mum. I think it's one of those things because it has a certifiable history, not only within releases, but also within the distillery history. So for example, I've got a pre-discontinuement bottle of Glendronach 15, which I bought before it was discontinued because I had a heads up. But that bottle had, people know it's in their consciousness that, this is from a time period before kind of the casking changed on it. And so there's kind of that backstory already existing, and it's easily accessible for someone who wouldn't know anything about Glendronach to go and look that up and verify
just
that.
the story. Is it just the story?
It's
not whether it's OB or IB. Is it just the story behind that? The fact that it was pre-discontinuement and everything.
But I think, every IB is short-lived, and so everything is it's there and it's gone, it's there and it's gone, and it's consistent in that nature. And so I think an OB has time to gain legendary status and sort of become a favorite and a fan, a fan of the crowd before then disappearing. Whereas an IB, it's so by the time it gets the hype, or by the time that the person, if you're a collector's point of view, by the time it gets the hype, it's really, it has to be like the top distillery from the top name, and an IB, Port Ellen, Brora, Kurosawa, Chichabu, yeah, of course they're going to go for wild amounts on, because it's the name of the distillery.
Because of the brand, not the IB.
Yeah, it's the brand that's doing it. Whereas, Mortlach 16, it's exactly that, the flora and fauna. It's a nice whiskey. To me, it's a little bit over sulfured, but
I agree.
It's it's a whiskey that
over there. I know which one you mean.
I have a bottle of that in my collection, and it's one of those things. I'm like, well, it's a lovely whiskey. It's very reticent of great memories for me, but
it did change a fair bit as well. That one, it did change.
It did.
Quite a bit different. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually tasted the Mortlach 16 Flora and Fauna recently against the new 16-year-old that they've released.
The new 16's pretty good.
To be entirely
like
honest,
it.
I tasted them side by side, and I prefer the new 16.
Same.
Yeah, more bourbon cask. It showcases the Mortlach spirit. But
yeah, it's softer. It's more generous.
Absolutely. It's a better spirit.
By the way, Gerald pops up again and says, the only reason I suggested that country climate knowledge was because working in a whiskey bar in Sydney, a lot of guests would always ask what the best whiskey money can buy is, and they would always look surprised and sometimes underwhelmed that it happens to be a younger non-Scotch whiskey. They're expecting something like a 30 or 40-year-old Scotch. And that, I mean, even from my own experience, and I love to hear this, especially from the bar people in here as well. I distinctly remember standing at Baxter's one night, and I was picking out some obscurities and oddities that I could see and on the back bar, and I was like, I'm just interested to see what had come in. And a guy comes up next to me and says, what's the highest age statement you got? That's right. He asked what the highest age statement whiskey you got. It's the oldest whiskey you've got. And
classic whiskey show question.
Yeah, it's a classic whiskey show question. And the bartender at Baxter sort of held the eye roll back a bit and said, what was that, Alex?
Love the whiskey show though.
Love Whiskey Fair, show, trade, live, all of them. Love.
You forgot and dreams.
And all that, yes. Love the Ritz. But do the classic whiskey show question, isn't it? It's like, anyway, what's the oldest whiskey you've got? I don't want to try the core range. And the bartender suggested Glenfarclas 40 because they had a reasonable supply of it at the time. This is a while ago, before it was even harder to get. And he ordered those, and then he came back, and I was sitting up at the bar area, and he ordered some Ardbegs after that. And he said, what's the best Ardbeg you've got? And the bartender at the time said, okay, well, and he found, I think, a 1977 and a Arignam-based 1990. They're, I think this one's 700 a dram, and this one's 900 a dram. And he said, well, 2 of each. And I'm sort of a bit stunned at this, near $4,000 order for 4 drinks. And I said to him, you must be a massive Ardbeg fan. I couldn't help myself. I had to say something. I turned to him and I said, you must be a massive Ardbeg fan to order that. And he said, I've never had it before, but I just want the best. And I said, what do we live in? The world we live in. So it was like...
I honestly haven't had a customer like that for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
It still happens.
I know a guy that goes in and I had a friend of mine say, he said, don't suppose you know where I can get any, 25, 30-year-old Suntory whiskey. It's just like Yamazaki, Hibiki, Hakushu, anything, like just anything like 25 plus. Like not a clue. Like, I was like, I don't have anything sitting around. This is like wine. It's just like, well, I've got this guy, and it's his customer's gone through all of our Hibiki 35, and he finished off the bottle the other week and said, have you got any more? And he said, no, that's it. And this is like, he said, we'll try and get something in for me so that I can, drink something next time I'm back. What? There's plenty of other things. And, obviously from the bar's point of view, they're like, well, we can charge you, $1,000 a nip rather than $200 a nip. But, realistically, you're working on the same GP as well. So it's sort of,
yeah.
I am just going to say that those people, though, that's their whiskey journey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
that's fine.
Down to them. Fucking bring it. Like,
oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I will have that. I had the oldest, the best, all of that experience from the range on my back bar. And if you're going to come in and do that, let's do it.
Yeah.
Because
absolutely. Yeah. No, absolutely. I just it's an education in some ways.
If my team get those people in our venue, they go crazy. I remember one of them sold we had the Highland Park Thor, which is part of the Valhalla range. And my team were just like, fuck it, let's do this.
Yeah.
And they were so excited about selling these drams. And we have Macallan Grand Reserva, and they were just off the chain, crazy excited to be pulling that bottle off the back bar and pouring it. So, I mean, if that's your whiskey journey, let's get down.
Yeah. And the advantage is if you then get to learn off that, we talked about it in previous episodes that my knowledge has come from working for a guy, Sukhinder, who has this ridiculous, crazy knowledge of vintage bottles and, vintage whiskies, not vintage as, a vintage, but vintage as in, whiskeys in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
And sitting next to him and just listening to him, I didn't need to always taste. It was just him saying to me, is that this is really good. This is what they did better at this time of year. And this is what they did better at this period. And this is why they're really popular now, because of what they did here. They're not doing that anymore. So we doubt that actually that will last, and they've got to do this to make sure they're still popular. But, they were really popular because at this point they were doing amazing stuff and they were really cool and in vogue. Now it's all marketing hype and it's not as good. But and you learn that information, you learn that profile and taste. So sometimes it's actually just listening to these people that get to taste this stuff and going, why is that so cool? What's interesting about that? What's and you learn. And like Aranam Best, it's like, my God,
that whiskey was fucking cool.
Yeah,
it was so fucking cool. And that's actually. Sorry, that was actually like a perfect example of that, where I just got to listen to people talking about it until I finally got to taste it, where I was working with the person who taught me basically how to bartend, which was Joey Ty, and she basically gave me this whiskey and taught me about it without giving me a taste of it. Just go, this is what this whiskey is and why it's so prevalent to this industry and to this style. And I just learned so much about it and how Ardbeg is made and everything from that one particular expression. Yeah. Until I finally got to taste it like 2 years later.
I'll just grab some of the questions coming through.
Ball of questions.
There's so many good questions coming through. So, Lockie and Emma, one of your ex-colleagues, Tom Scott, of course, Mr. Tom Scott.
Oh dear.
Tom, I've renamed you Happy Face, as you know. So, Tom, here you go. After the explosion of Japanese whiskey and Australian whiskey getting good recognition, just not enough product to sell to have the same explosion Japan had. Where do you think the next region to explode globally will be? Or what are some of the best new old whiskies you are seeing? Emma, start with you. Go.
Oh, I think honestly, I'm a little bit biased, a little bit patriotic. I hope that kind of an attention shifts more back towards America and the new kind of things that are coming up in the American scene, because it's not just we make bourbon, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's, you know, we're making single malt, we're making this, you know, this grain, we're making all sorts of really cool stuff. And I think people are coming back into bourbon and accepting it back into the fold, as it were, because I know for a long time it has really been seen as the unrefined drinkers, which is silly. But I know that's, yeah, well, not just American single malts, but American bourbons and whatnot, you know. And there's some incredible stuff out there that just isn't seen and isn't heard because it's drowned out by your Jim Beams, your Jack Daniels, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, there are people who like to drink that, but I think cool bourbon and cool American whiskey needs to make a comeback, for me personally, anyway.
Alex, hit me.
Uh,
What's the next New World region that is doing really well on your palate, and what do you think will explode?
Jesus. I agree with Emma. You all know that I'm a huge fan of American whiskey, especially American single malts at the moment. Like, they're my new favorite category. Because anyone that's like, I only drink single malts, I only drink Scotch or something like that, I'm like, boom, give them that. Or I only drink bourbon, I give them an American single malt. And it's just such a fun category to play in. I remember when I first started into American single malts, it knocked my socks off. Like, I was just like, well, I don't know where I am. Of like, I love single malt so much, but I love American whiskey so much. And it was just the perfect collision of two worlds for me. I do like a lot of these Scandi, for lack of a better description, style whiskeys coming out. Holy hell, there are some amazing stuff. Flokies, the McMirrors, like, oh, like my heart. They're amazing.
They're super intense and geeky about it as well.
I am super excited by Scando,
Like
Scando whiskey.
Just by the way, this is a bit of a leak, by the way, but the
like,
next
does it for me. Seriously does it for me.
we've got 2 new codes just allocated last week for Society for Scandinavian whiskies, which is super exciting for us, and for some single casks coming through, and a few more American codes as well, both in B and single malt, which is also exciting for us. But yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you, Alex.
Yeah, some of the stuff that's coming out is like,
yeah,
really shouldn't speak while I've been drinking on live TV, but like some of it is just, I'm at the phone and like touch myself style whiskey, like it's fucking amazing.
Yeah, I remember years ago trying Stoning and it just blew me away. Yeah.
It took me three or 4 years. So I used to run the whiskey show in the UK. I think it took me 4 years for them to actually be ready. And I remember, you know, pretty much every Scandi producer I was emailed every single year and contacted every single year. I was just like, are you ready to come to the show? Are you ready to come? And they're like, not yet, not yet, not yet. And it was my final one that I pretty much got most of them there. And I was just like, at last. And credit to them, because they were all just like, no, we're not ready. We're not there yet.
Yep.
We'll wait.
The Scandi producers are ready. They're ready to take the time. That's what really impresses me by them. I've had some whiskeys from them that are absolutely stunning. And then I've also had samples from them that are not ready, and they send it to me saying, this is not ready yet. But this is, you know.
Yeah.
Can I just quickly say hi? I'm watching the comments come through. Alana, I love you. G. Pete Stevens, holy hell.
Everyone's in here. Yeah.
Pretty hilarious.
Good to see you, G. And there's a great question from G here. He says, have you ever played the game Shag, Kill or Marry with whiskies?
Can we please do that next week?
Okay, that's next week, G. G, tune in next week. We're doing week 5.
I'll come in for that.
You're into the blocky. But a great question from Alana, who says, do specific history and tradition provide for the consumer an easy point of reference and knowledge base to learn from and put words to tastes, then building their own palate lexicon?
Can I just like mic drop? She's one of mine. Like fucking boom.
Done.
You got to get in. You got to get in. I'm the first tasting I did of Dead Rabbit and Dublin Liberties in Sydney. I did this tasting, and at the beginning I saw someone wearing a Dead Rabbit t-shirt, and then didn't see them at the event, and they kind of looked at me quite sort of as if they knew what I was talking about, but didn't let on anything. And then at the very end of the event, they were like, "Oh, hi, I used to work at Dublin Liberties," and so we went to the launch of Dublin Liberties, and we used to live in Dublin. I was like, "What?" Just like, why didn't you say something? It's like, I'm glad you told me at the end rather than the beginning. It's like, it's the worst thing at the beginning of a tasting when someone, the last Old Pulteney tasting I did, someone turned up and the very first thing you said is I'm from Wick, and you're just like, oh shit.
Well, fuck.
You're one of the 600 people that live in Wick. Fantastic. Tasting. Yeah, I always love it when that happens, and that's happened to me a few times where someone's been in the audience and you go, "Yeah, I'm glad you told me. Actually, I'm glad you told me afterwards and not before that you were here." Yeah.
It's the best card to hold in your playbook.
Yeah, exactly. There's a question that I want to pose to the three bartenders in here. Kathleen asks, Kathleen Davies, big shout out to you, love you to bits. Question: what are your thoughts on Aussie rye, discovery of Aussie rye with consumers? Is curiosity growing? Andy will be back.
Yes, absolutely. Aussie rye is such a cool category, and it's something that, well, for myself and the other people at Whisky Roundtable, we've been holding out for, knowing that a lot of producers have been aiming for this uniquely Australian rye category.
Yeah.
With distillers like Archie Rose, the Gospel / Melbourne Moonshine Boys. Well, they released a couple of young rye whiskies prior. Spirit drinks. And some really cool other rye-focused spirits coming from all around Australia. And I think it's a really cool category that can showcase Australiana whiskey in a really new way. And I'd really like to see it develop more.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think people have really kind of sat up and taken notice, especially with the Archie Rye releases. I think that was kind of the impetus for consumers, especially in Australia, to take notice and seriously consider the category. So,
Alex, how about you?
I love rye, so I don't care what region it comes from. However, I do love Australian rye, specifically Old Mate Belgrove.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh, Peter.
The OG Aussie rye.
He was in our roundtable last week, wasn't it? Was it week before? No, it was last week.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know what? With Peter Bignell, you're never short of stories. There's you're never short of stories to tell with his product. It's so fun and so rich and so vibrant.
Yeah.
So incredible.
Some of the he's just becoming one of those classic Bill Lark characters, and I'm not comparing the two at all because, oh my God, they're both beautiful individuals.
Absolutely, yeah.
Talk about just heart and soul.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that, when we're talking about marketing that kind of thing with Australian whiskey is one of the biggest things that we can do in a good way, is marketing the heart and soul of Australian whiskey, like these people, like Peter Bignell from Belgrove, like Bill Lark. There's just so many amazing stories about these guys ground up.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I want to mention, though, on this topic is not just about rye whiskey, it's just about American style whiskeys, or that category of American whiskey being corn-based, rye-based, wheat-based, is talking about the fact that Australia is the largest consumer of American whiskey per capita, at least.
Yeah.
I would like to see, for per capita at least. So I would like to see more Australian producers look towards that American inspiration rather than just going, here's a single malt, it's 500 mils, $500 a bottle, have fun. I would like to see more American categories whiskies in Australia. We've had some incredible producers. Some of my favorites being Gospel, Upshot, Archie Rose, and Belgrove, producing these incredible, absolutely incredible American whiskies. Upshot Cask Strength, I think, is my favorite American style whiskey in Australia without fail.
It's a bit of a harder one to find at Cask Strength, isn't it? The Upshot.
It is, but
yeah. That was actually one of the more fascinating distillery tours I've ever done, actually.
Yeah.
I feel like it needs just a little bit longer.
Yeah, it needs a bit longer in the oak, maybe. Yeah, it's look, I like it. It's fascinating. What's the proof on the Cask Strength, Lockie?
64.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's big. And look, they've made some odd decisions.
That's just a hell of a lot of whiskey burn for me right there.
They got to 64.
No, they at least 3 years ago, they were casking at 43. Yeah.
So to put that into perspective, all the cars they were filling at 43, and then they moved to filling some cars at a higher proof for their cask strength release.
Yeah, and there were like one row of casks at 63.5, but like they were casking at 43, which I thought was ambitious.
And they still are.
Yeah, I mean, because it might drop, and then you might be stuffed. G says we need more Aussie rye to rival the US. I can get behind that.
I mean, want to grow the population.
It will never, at this stage, in 20 years' time maybe, but it will never rival the American ryes because size of production, the size of business, size of stock under hand, it's so different. And it's this argument that I've seen a lot online in the last week or last 7 days about pricing and cost of things, and it's things like, well, we're not Diageo. Everyone isn't Diageo and hasn't just been sitting on stock for 150 years, 200 years. That people have overheads and people have things to pay for, and if you're not producing 300,000 hectoliters per annum, you still have to make the same amount of money at the end of it. And it's there's some incredible Aussie rye, but it's it'd be nice. I look forward to the day where, and it sounds a weird thing to say, but where we have commercial distilleries in Australia, because I think there's very few commercial distilleries that are strong businesses that are going to be making a lot of money and a lot of whiskey in the next 20-30 years. There's a lot of amazing distillers in Australia, don't get me wrong, but
without a blending market, there's no need for them really until
exactly.
Yeah. And also, are Australians drinking enough Australian whiskey to be able to support them to become commercial distilleries?
Because there's not enough affordable whiskey to be drinking.
There we have
it's a lovely thought, but it's just so unrealistic, especially at this point in time. Like if you look at it, maybe 50 years down the line, maybe on the world stage, Australian whiskies might be in a position to do that. But at the moment, with taxation, with space, with growth, with all that kind of stuff, when you're competing against people like Glenfiddich, who are just huge. Like we couldn't even possibly fathom making that much whiskey, in a facility, anything similar in Australia, and selling it at that price. So I think.
Well, just remember the second biggest distillery in the world is in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely.
And more to the point is yes, we don't have the funding, but someone could quite easily come in and say, okay, I'm going to invest in a behemoth distillery in Australia, and it's going to be a big thing in Australia. It's all these distilleries across the world. There's multiple. Paul John in India. Our single malt whiskey is a tiny proportion of what we make as a distillery. There's a huge amount of other stuff that they make, and so that's where their revenue comes from. And so, is it a case of someone just coming in and saying, "All right, I'm investing hard in and that's how, you know, for us at Starwood, that's how we've been able to survive. Is
30 million
we've
people
got
in Australia, like the
we've got
population.
venture capital money that's helping that go forward, and it's not a case of like, you know, it's we think of it as a small business person trying to set up a business, whereas actually, you know, if someone wants to come in and say, okay, you know, from a venture capital perspective, you know, right, I'm investing in this. I want to, you know, I've got a investment fund. We're investing in this project, and it's going to be a huge distillery with the same output as, you know, Kalila.
Yep.
Go.
Yeah.
So
But I think, I don't want to be Debbie Downer, but I think realistically that there's no time in the near future where even if you do have that, you know, big distillery, that huge production power and all that kind of stuff, I just think it would take so long to compete with the historical backing and the marketing and whatnot of these bigger places. So I think we should give as much as we can to our craft industry, but also, you know, be realistic and not be like, well, you know,
But if you're there on,
I'm better than, you know,
if you're there on price, then you're not talking about craft. So
but
if you push to mainstream, then you're competing on a mainstream level, and so you're competing in a different sphere. And I think
ooh, no, we're not going down that path. Sorry.
yeah, I think, and a lot of distilleries, sorry, a lot of consumers would probably rather, you know, it's in the same way they see it with craft beer. People would rather drink local beer rather than, you know, Heineken and Peroni and so forth. They'd rather drink 4X and
exactly.
Hahn and 2Es and stuff. And so if you can have something that competes on the same level as, you know, Hahn, 2Es, 4X, and a whiskey level that's competing with Johnny Walker, Bell's, Teachers, maybe the tables will change, and maybe actually we'll start looking at different levels.
yeah, but I'm very pessimistic. I reckon it will take a long time. No, I 100% agree. But I think, you know, look, like we're a craft whiskey and beer bar, and I still have people walk through the door being like, do you have Asahi? Can I get an Asahi? And I'm like, you know, that's fine. You know, you like what you like to drink. But I think, you know, we need to be realistic about, and businesses need to be realistic about the way that they approach their marketing strategies and their production strategies in order to give as much as possible and get themselves out there while still, you know, being realistic that it's not going to happen overnight. I'm not going to be the next, you know, Glenfarclas, Glenfiddich, the next Jim Beam or whatever. So, yeah.
But Glenfarclas is still a family-owned distillery.
It is. And Andy, I want to add on to what you've been saying about Australian whiskey won't evolve until we start a blending industry. And one thing comes to mind, which is when I was chatting to